Hello everyone, welcome to J Talks Crime. That's right, I am back at it again with another true crime case for you all. If you have a moment, please smash that subscribe button, join the true crime community, and help the channel grow. We are on case number 28, and my oh my, have I gotten an extremely controversial case to talk about today. Let's go ahead and throw up the disclaimer on screen if you are watching this on YouTube. Massive trigger warning for everyone. This case is going to upset and piss you off. Not only does this case revolve around extremely young children, but it's also going to bring up very controversial topics. As you all may already know, I am a very opinionated person, especially when it comes to the protection of children. I'm sure not everyone will agree with some of my comments that I will be expressing during this episode. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but please, if you do leave comments, be respectful. I will be discussing topics such as sexuality, gender identity, sexual abuse, and among other delicate subjects. What happened to these two boys is disgusting to say the least. It's a case that is almost 60 years old, and yet no one really likes to talk about it to this day. And as I go through the story, you all will understand why. I created this channel to spread awareness. If you have been here for a while, then you know I talk about some of the darkest cases in existence. It's not an easy thing to research or do, but these cases need to be talked about more often. The victims need to be remembered. Hopefully by me talking about these cases, you as an audience can learn something, and with that, maybe we can prevent cases like this from ever happening again. But alright, enough of me procrastinating. Let's dive into the case of David and Brian Reimer. Let's start at the very beginning. David, whose birth name was Bruce Peter Reimer, and Brian Henry Reimer were identical twins born on August 22nd, 1965, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Both boys were born healthy and happy to parents Janet and Ron Reimer. For the first 6 months of life, they had normal lives, at least as normal lives as could be for 6-month-old babies. Both David and Brian were born male. There is a common misconception that David was born intersex. I want to make it clear now that neither of these boys were intersex. They were born with fully functioning male parts only. At around 6 months old, both David and Brian began having difficulty with urinating. Their parents were obviously concerned by this, and they took the boys to the doctor when the symptom didn't improve. David and Brian were both diagnosed with phimosis, a condition in which the foreskin of the penis cannot stretch to allow it to be pulled back past the glands. This can cause difficulty in urination and typically happens to uncircumcised males. Upon the diagnosis, the doctor recommended that David and Brian be circumcised to resolve their issue. Ron and Janet were brand new parents and fully trusted this doctor. They had no reason not to. They just wanted this issue to be fixed so that their babies weren't in any further discomfort. On April 27, 1966, both David and Brian were scheduled to undergo a circumcision. It was supposed to be a standard routine procedure. Ron and Janet were under the impression that their son's circumcisions would be completed the standard way, which is by a scalpel or a blade. But for unknown reasons, this physician went with the unconventional technique called electrocauterization. For this method, a metal-like needle probe heated by an electrical current is used. David was the first infant selected to undergo the circumcision, and the procedure went horribly wrong. David's penis was severely burned. We don't know to what extent, to be honest. The severity has never been made clear. But allegedly it was burned beyond surgical repair, and some sources state that his penis had been completely severed from his body. But the truth is, we don't know with 100% certainty what the actual damage was. Janet and Ron were informed of the accident, and Janet later, while talking about this moment, stated, quote, "I could not comprehend what he was talking about, because you see, I thought they were going to use a knife. I didn't know there was electricity involved," end quote. I'm already getting so angry. I don't care that this was the 1960s. I want to understand why the parents weren't informed of how this procedure was going to go. Why they didn't go with the standard method with a scalpel, I guess the world will never know. After David's botched surgery, Brian, of course, did not go through with a circumcision procedure, and his phimosis had healed naturally within a couple of months. The fact that the phimosis did end up going away on its own makes this situation so much more sad. Since Brian's phimosis healed naturally, we can all safely assume David's would have also probably healed just fine on its own. All of this could have been prevented, and that's what is so frustrating about this case. After David's injury, his parents were horrified and scared for their son's future. Janet has said that every time she changed his diaper after the accident, she would just burst into tears. Being a brand new parent and something this horrible happening to your baby, I couldn't even imagine how they felt or how painful processing this situation would have been for them. David's genitals were mutilated beyond repair, and during this time, genital reconstruction surgery was in its very early stages. It was determined that David would never have any sexual function after the accident. Ron and Janet were terrified for their son. They constantly worried about his entire future, how he was going to cope with this accident. They worried about his mental health and other people bullying him for his injury. They had no clue what to do. They felt completely hopeless on how to help their son. Several months went by and Ron and Janet were getting desperate. They wanted their son to grow up with a normal childhood and felt that without functioning genitals, this would be impossible when he got older and began puberty. Then one night, Ron and Janet were watching TV and they landed on a program that was featuring a psychologist by the name of Dr. Joan. He was extremely charismatic on this program as he was explaining his views on gender identity. He believed that a person's gender is based on nurture instead of nature. He hypothesized that one's gender identity is developed primarily as a result of social learning from early childhood and that it could be changed with the appropriate behavioral interventions. Ron and Janet, upon listening to this man, for the first time, they had hope that their child could grow up and live a normal and happy life. I think most of us can agree that we as a society still can't fully understand gender and gender identity now in 2024. So in the 1960s, there was almost no understanding at all. During the 1960s, there was a basic level of understanding filled with gender stereotypes. If you were a boy, then you did masculine things. You played sports. You were strong. You were the main breadwinner. If you were a girl, you did feminine things. You played with dolls and makeup. You were a nurturer and you stayed home and raised the kids. Thankfully, we are in the process of breaking gender stereotypes. There is nothing wrong with having masculine qualities when you're a female, and there's nothing wrong with having feminine qualities if you are a male. You are who you are at the end of the day. In 1967, Janet and Ron reached out immediately to this clown, John Money, to explain their situation to him, and within a few weeks, the family traveled to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland to see him. Upon this visit, Money and his team explained to Ron and Janet how they would be able to turn David from their son into their daughter. He was adamant that David was not going to be able to live a decent life unless he was living it as a female due to his accident. This man had a lot of unethical theories on sex and gender in general, but he was the professional. This was his expertise. This was his life's work. And Janet and Ron were willing to try anything at this point to help their son, even if that meant that he would have to become their daughter. The story is going to get much worse. But I honestly really don't blame Janet or Ron at all for anything that ended up happening. They were scared. They did everything out of love and compassion for their children. They would eventually feel beyond guilt, and they understand now that they should have never listened to Dr. Dumbass. And if you think I'm being harsh on Money, just wait. Ron and Janet were advised to have David undergo a full sex reassignment surgery operation as soon as possible. They were instructed that in order to save their child from a difficult life, they were going to need to raise him as a girl. Following this consultation, Janet and Ron were convinced that this will be David's best chance, and they began making immediate plans for David to go through sex reassignment surgery. At only 22 months old, David underwent a bilateral orchiectomy, which is the removal of both testicles. They then constructed a vestigial vulva and a vaginal canal in their place. Money believed that everyone is gender neutral until the age of 2 years old, so he had instructed David's parents to get this sex reassignment surgery as quickly as possible. With this successful procedure, David was also given the new name Brenda, as it was similar to his original name Bruce, and his parents began to raise him as a girl. But to avoid confusion and for respect, I will continue to call him David, the name he will eventually choose for himself. It's awful to say, but giving babies full sex reassignment surgery during this time was a very common practice for babies who were born intersex. These are real human lives, and for them to have had no say in this is completely fucked up in my opinion. To have a decision like this made for you before you even know who you are is horrendous. None of these children had any choice in what happened to their own bodies. David also didn't get to have a choice in the matter. The twins were starting to grow up, and David was being raised as a little girl. He had no idea that he had actually been born a boy. Dr. Dipshit, in the meantime, was very excited about the twins growing up. He knew it was going to be the perfect way to conduct research and prove his theories regarding gender identity. Since David and Brian were in fact identical twins, they were the perfect test subjects. Brian is the ideal control for the experiment, as he is being raised as his biological sex, and David, who has the same genetic makeup as his brother, is also being raised under the same household, but is instead being raised as a girl. All David and Brian were to him were guinea pigs. He didn't care about them as human beings. All he cared about was proving that his theories were correct. He began this case study, which he referred to in his documentations as the Joan case, to keep the identities of David and Brian as anonymous. Money made it abundantly clear that neither David nor Brian could ever know the truth about David's biological sex. The first year or so, Ron and Janet were hopeful that this arrangement was going to work. But as David was getting older, he was already showing signs that he was rejecting this female identity. David hated playing with girl toys such as dolls. Whenever Janet had put him in a dress, he would rip it right off. He demonstrated that he would rather play with his brother's toys than any of his own. David was also caught on multiple occasions standing up to pee while in school. Their parents were beginning to worry that this plan was not going to work, but Money kept insisting that this experiment was going to work as long as they stuck to the plan, and throughout the next several years, the twins were brought in to see him so he can study and document their progress. In addition to the full castration of David, Money also advised that David receive estrogen hormones to help feminize David's body. During visitations with both David and Brian, the doctor would notate that David was much neater than his twin brother. He also had described David as stubborn and dominant, but concluded that these were just tomboy traits. As David and Brian entered adolescence, it was clear to their parents that David was still displaying masculine traits. No matter how hard they tried to get David to do girl things, he would rebel. David and Brian looked the exact same physically. You know how some identical twins you are able to see some subtle differences that you can tell them apart? That wasn't the case for David and Brian. The only physical difference between them was that David had longer hair that he was made to grow out to, of course, present as a female. Due to the striking resemblance of the twins, David was frequently bullied in school for not only looking exactly like his brother, but because he also displayed masculine traits in school. He was called names like caveman and freak on an everyday basis.
Brenda had almost no friends growing up. Girls didn't want to play with her because she wanted to play boy things. And boys, of course, didn't want a girl in their games.
Well, the kids at school were bullying me because I was different. That's what kids do. Kids always bully somebody who's different. It's the law.
David's childhood was filled with confusion and loneliness because he didn't fit in with anyone. David didn't have anything in common with the girls in his class, and the boys thought that he was some weird masculine girl, constantly made fun of him, and didn't want anything to do with him. When Brian reflected on his childhood and growing up with his sibling, he stated, quote, "She walked like a guy, sat with her legs apart. She talked about guy things, didn't give a crap about cleaning house, getting married, wearing makeup. We both wanted to play with guys, build forts, and have snowball fights, and play army. She'd get a skipping rope for a gift, and the only thing we'd use that for was to tie people up, whip people with it. She played with my toys, Tinker toys, dump trucks. This toy sewing machine she got just sat." End quote. Janet and Ron were having more and more doubts about the entire situation. Meanwhile, Dr. Dickweed was documenting that this case study of the Reimer twins was a complete success and kept telling Ron and Janet that it was working and continued to be patient. Every so often, like I said, David and Brian were taken to see the doctor in Baltimore. Of course, they were never told why they had to see him, but each visit became hell for these boys. I want to give a warning here. If anyone doesn't want to hear about the disgusting sexual-themed abuse that these little boys had to endure, I'll put in a timestamp now for you all to skip ahead for this part, and I will also leave it in the description below. At the age of just 6 years old, Money began to show the brothers pornographic photos. Then, after showing them these photos, he instructed the brothers to act out sexual positions with each other. David was ordered to get on all fours, while Brian was ordered to come up behind David and press his crotch against his brother's butt. In another session, he ordered David to lay on his back with his legs spread open and for Brian to get on top.
The type of questions that we were asked were sexual in nature, to the point where it'd make me blush. If I would think of talking that way to my son, I'd be very embarrassed. It is very explicit about the sexual parts.
To try and make Brenda understand that she was a girl, Dr. Money showed her a book called Two Births. It contained explicit photographs of women giving birth and was clearly shocking for a young child.
I thought he was perverted. I thought he was a sick man. My parents didn't know a lot that was going on. And if they would have known, it never would have happened. When my folks weren't around, well then, we did what we were told, and if we didn't, then we got yelled at to the point where we thought we were going to get backhanded. If we were told to take our clothes off, well, eventually we took our clothes off and sat on the couch, had photos of us taken.
This is fucking disgusting. These are kids that are 6, 7, 8 years old. Dr. Piece of Shit had even taken photos on at least one occasion with the twins in these sexual positions. And if that wasn't bad enough, he would also command them to strip down naked in front of him, a grown-ass man, and instruct them to inspect each other's private parts. He had made them physically touch each other. In an interview years after this happened, David talked about these awful sessions and stated, quote, "He told me to take my clothes off, and I just did not do it. I just stood there, and he screamed, 'Now!' I thought he was going to give me a whooping, so I took my clothes off and stood there shaking." End quote. Having the twins participate in what Money referred to as sexual rehearsing was, as you can imagine, traumatizing for them. The sick man believed that sexual rehearsing, and I hate to even call it that, was important for a healthy adult gender identity. Excuse my language, but what the fuck is he talking about? What drugs was this guy on? Someone let me know in the comments if anything I just described to you sounds like a normal thing to do when you are 6 years old. He forced siblings to act out sexual positions in front of him, and there was even a couple of times, according to both David and Brian, that he had some members of his team come in and watch them perform these positions as well. There's nothing normal about this, and if anyone who is watching or listening thinks that this is something normal and okay to do to children, then something is wrong with you, and I sincerely hope you get some sort of professional help. Nothing about this is okay. It's sickening, and it makes me want to throw up. This doctor was a predator as far as I'm concerned. Whenever David or Brian would refuse to participate, he would yell and scream at them until they would comply.
The experiments that he made us do, going into sexual positions with no clothes on, and taking pictures of us, how degrading for a 7-year-old.
I don't know if this man had some sort of sexual gratification from forcing these boys to do these things or what. God knows how many times he made them do these things, and I'm willing to bet that David and Brian weren't the only children that he had done this to. In 1975, when the twins were 9 years old, Money published a paper detailing his observations from the Joan case, and he labeled the experiment as a complete success. In the paper, he stated, quote, "Her behavior is so normally that of an active little girl, and so clearly different by the contrast from the boyish ways of her twin brother that it offers nothing to stimulate one's conjectures." End quote. So this guy was not only sick, but he was delusional as well. The older David got, the more unhappy he became. He suffered from severe gender dysphoria by the time he was a preteen. David expressed these feelings to his parents on multiple occasions, but they tried to dismiss his emotions and tried to convince him that he was just a tomboy and that this was just a phase that he would eventually grow out of. David wasn't the only one struggling. His parents were also falling apart from this lifelong secret. Ron sunk into alcoholism, and Janet had attempted to take her own life. As David and Brian entered their teen years, it became more clear than ever to Janet and Ron that David was not conforming into a female gender identity. Since David was regularly taking estrogen for several years now, he did start growing breasts, but he also developed broad shoulders and a thick neck, making him appear more masculine. At the time, David believed that something was wrong with him because of the way he was feeling, and he fell into a deep suicidal depression. At just 13 years old, when Janet and Ron tried to get David to see Dr. Asshole, he threatened to take his own life if they ever made him go back and see him again. Ron and Janet were heartbroken hearing their child threaten his own life. And I think it was at this point where they knew that all of this had just been a massive mistake. But now they were terrified to tell their son the truth for multiple reasons. They believed that David was going to blame and hate them for his horrible childhood. Janet and Ron didn't want to face the truth because that would mean all of their efforts they had made to give their child a happy and normal life was for nothing. They were still in contact with Money and his team, and all of them kept advising that telling David and Brian the truth would ruin everything that they worked for. But finally, on March 14th, 1980, when David and Brian were 14 years old, Ron took them out one day and he explained to them both that David had been born a male and was originally named Bruce. He told them everything, how a botched circumcision had left David with a mutilated penis. He told them about how they had found Dr. Dickwad and how they had been convinced that raising David as a girl was his best chance to grow up happy. He told them everything. David wasn't just angry with this news, he was also beyond relieved.
I don't remember 90% of what happened in the car. Dad told me that I had a glaze over my eyes and I was staring over the dashboard and I had ice cream all over me that was melted. And I thought to myself, well, I'm not crazy, I'm not turning insane. And I thought I was turning insane.
At that moment, she said, I do not want to be a girl, I want to be a boy. So I said, okay, are you sure? Because there's no going back after. And he said, yes, he said, yes, I am sure that is what I want to do.
He seriously thought that he was crazy and that something serious was wrong with him. But once his father had revealed the truth, everything made sense to him now. I can't even imagine how good it must have felt for David to finally know the truth. Within a couple of weeks with this realization, David made the decision to go through the transition back to a male gender, which he named himself David, identifying with the biblical David who fought Goliath. He cut off his hair, dressed the way he wanted. He went through treatments to reverse the gender reassignment by getting testosterone injections. He went through a double mastectomy, and he had surgery to have a penis reconstructed for him, which thankfully was successful and fully functional. David was now living his life as himself, but he would suffer mentally for the rest of his life. Both David and Brian had been traumatized by Money's experiments on them as children. The deterioration of their mental health followed them into adulthood. Brian became addicted to drugs to cope with his trauma and began getting into trouble for petty theft. In his early 20s, Brian was diagnosed with depression and schizophrenia. He and his brother's relationship was further strained as David received far more attention than him once David's true biology was revealed. David would attempt suicide multiple times over the years. David also had a lot of anger towards the doctor who had botched his circumcision surgery all those years ago when he was a baby. The Reimer family finally sued the hospital for the accident, and David was eventually awarded $73,000 in a civil lawsuit settlement, which, let's be honest, isn't anywhere near enough for all of the pain both of the Reimer twins had suffered. In the mid-1990s, David met another psychologist named Milton Diamond, who was a known academic rival to Money. David participated in a follow-up study conducted by Diamond. Diamond notated all of Money's failures in David's childhood transition. Upon finding out that the publication of Dr. Money's findings regarding the Joan case had resulted in the normalization of sex reassignment surgeries for intersex-born people and for males that had traumatic injuries to their genitalia, David decided that he needed to come forward with his story. In 1997, David began speaking publicly about his experiences and his traumatic childhood. He made it clear that his interactions with this horrible man were torturous and abusive. David came forward because he wanted to prevent anything like this from happening to future children in similar situations like he had found himself in. David later appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show with his mother, Janet, so they could share their story. During this show, David had expressed that he had fully forgiven his mother. He went on to say that everything she did for him out of love, and that he did not blame her for his trauma. I will link this video in the description if anyone wants to watch the Oprah Winfrey segment. It truly is heart-wrenching. You can see both David's and Janet's pain. I do recommend watching it. I would have inserted the clip, but due to copyright, I am unable to. After David and his family came forward with the reality of the experiment, of course, Money tried to cover his ass. He claimed he had done nothing wrong during his sessions with David and Brian, and also claimed that the reason why it didn't work was because they had transitioned David when he was too old. Dude, he was 22 months old when he had a full sex reassignment surgery. That's not even 2 years old. Just what? He also blamed Janet and Ron because they had revealed to the brothers of David's true biological sex. His colleagues would later claim that Money would refuse to speak about the case any further due to the absolute failure of his theories from this case. So, he really couldn't care less about ruining the lives of an entire family. It was the fact that he had failed was the reason why he didn't want to publicly speak about the John Joan case. David and Brian's case became the subject of multiple books, articles, documentaries. The story was also told in the 2000 book As Nature Made Him by journalist John Colapinto. It's a case that has brought awareness to the complexities of gender identity and the ethicality of sex reassignment surgery in children. A lot of people want to use this case as a spectacle for transgender controversies. I myself don't get this at all because no one in this case is trans. David's gender identity has always reflected as male, which happens to also be his biological sex. This poor man had been gaslighted by everyone in his life for him to conform into a female gender identity. This case does not have any bearings on the trans issues or community, and that's all I've got to say on that matter. David spent most of his adult life working odd jobs. He had never finished high school due to dropping out from the vicious bullying he suffered. He did marry a woman named Jane Fontaine in 1990 and adopted her 3 children from a previous relationship. He was known to have enjoyed hobbies such as camping, fishing, and coin collecting. Brian had also married 2 different women and had sadly divorced them both. Brian went through a downward spiral, suffering from his depression and schizophrenia. Then on July 1st, 2002, at the age of 36, Brian had overdosed on his antidepressant medication he used for his schizophrenia. His death was officially ruled as a suicide, although a lot of people believe that the overdose could have been accidental. David was devastated by the death of his brother. Even though they somewhat had a strained relationship, Brian's death broke something in the already fragile David. He was already dealing with his own bouts of depression, but it seemed like losing his brother put him over the edge.
David used to come here quite often, bring him flowers, and I guess I don't know exactly what he talked about, but he came here and he talked to him quite a few times. It must have been at least 4 or 5 times a week.
By 2004, David was broke, unemployed, and having marital issues with his wife Jane. On May 2nd, 2004, David's wife Jane had asked for a separation from David.
First his brother died, whom he grieved over terribly. Then he made a very bad investment where a man absconded with the money. That was quite a lot of money. And he couldn't find a job. He was 38 years old. Who's going to hire you at semi-skilled work? He cried on his friend's shoulder for about 3 or 4 hours. And he says, I can't make my wife happy. My wife I just can't make her happy.
Then, on May 4th, 2004. David Reimer drove to a local grocery store parking lot in his hometown in Winnipeg. Shortly after parking his car, he committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. He was 38 years old. Janet and Ron, as you can imagine, were devastated with the death of both of their sons. They have been very public about their deaths and openly blame their son's ongoing mental issues and later deaths on Dr. Money. Both David and Brian suffered a lot during their short lives. This case is tragic from the beginning to the very end. It's infuriating thinking about all of the BS that David and Brian had to endure. I wish that this case could have had a happy ending, that David and Brian were able to overcome their mental issues and that they were able to live full, long, and happy lives. But that's just not the reality of this situation. Everyone around David and Brian failed them when they were children. What pisses me off most of all is that Dr. Money never had any repercussions for the sick, sexual things he had forced those little boys to do. Who knows how many other children had the same thing happen to them because of this asshole. This is an older case, and I pray that we are heading towards the right direction when it comes to gender identity issues. I'm not a black or white type of person. There are definitely layers to these types of issues. It's clearly way more complicated than just nature versus nurture. A lot of factors are involved, and every single person is different at the end of the day. David and Brian never had a real chance of a normal childhood, and as a result of the trauma they had faced, now they are both gone. But that is everything I have on this case. I know this one was a difficult one to get through. Trust me, I had to walk away while researching this one several times, but we got through it. If you have stayed this long, thank you so much. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you are in the mood and want to watch more of my cases, I will throw up one of my playlists on the screen now for you. But yeah, that is it, and I'll catch you guys in a few days for a new true crime news video. But until then, bye guys.